Hello, dear friend. Welcome to this quiet corner of the evening, where mysteries unfold like winter roses beneath moonlight, and sleep arrives on gentle footsteps through fog-wrapped streets. Tonight, I invite you into a world of Victorian shadows and gaslit wonder, where the great detective Sherlock Holmes encounters something most peculiar, a mystery wrapped in ice and legend, whispered about in the darkest corners of London's scientific societies. This story has been crafted especially for those moments when your mind needs to slow its turning, when thoughts require the gentle guidance of narrative to release their grip upon waking consciousness. Let this tale carry you softward into dreams, where snow falls perpetually outside tall windows, and mysteries solve themselves in the warmth of crackling hearths. I'm curious, where in this vast world are you listening from tonight? Perhaps from a city where rain taps against your window, or a countryside where silence wraps around your dwelling like a comfortable cloak. Wherever you find yourself, know that this story was created as a gift for your peaceful rest, a bridge between waking and sleeping that honors both states with equal reverence. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The snow had been falling over London for 3 consecutive days, transforming the familiar grime and bustle of the great metropolis into something approaching fairy tale enchantment. Each lamppost wore a crown of pristine white, and the normally cacophonous streets had fallen into a hushed reverence, muffled by nature's insulating blanket. From the window of 291B Baker Street, one could observe the way evening descended early during these winter months, painting the sky in shades of dove grey and deepest purple, while snowflakes continued their eternal descent like nature's own hypnotic rhythm. Inside our beloved rooms, the fire burned with particular enthusiasm, fed by Mrs. Hudson's attentive ministrations throughout the afternoon. The flames danced their ancient dance, casting shadows that played across the familiar furniture, the twin armchairs, the cluttered chemical table, the shelves groaning beneath volumes of esoteric knowledge. The warmth created its own microclimate within those walls, a pocket of comfort that stood in defiant contrast to the winter's grip beyond the window panes. Sherlock Holmes occupied his customary position in the chair nearest the fire, his long frame folded into that peculiar attitude of repose that somehow suggested both complete relaxation and coiled readiness. His eyes, half-lidded, watched the flames with an intensity that might have seemed unusual to one unfamiliar with his methods. Those grey eyes reflected firelight in their depths, twin mirrors capturing and transforming the dancing luminescence into something approaching meditation. I, Dr. John Watson, his faithful companion and chronicler of these strange adventures, had positioned myself in the opposite chair, a book resting open upon my lap, though I confess the words had ceased to register some minutes prior. There existed something profoundly soporific about evenings such as this, when the world outside contracted to exclude all but our immediate surroundings, when time itself seemed to slow its relentless march and allow moments to stretch languorously into one another. The clock upon the mantelpiece ticked with metronomic precision, each sound distinct, yet somehow contributing to the overall atmosphere of tranquility rather than disturbing it. Between ticks, one could discern other sounds, the soft settling of coals in the grate, the occasional whisper of snow against glass, the barely perceptible creaking of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. These were the sounds of comfort, of safety, of domestic peace. Watson, Holmes murmured, without shifting his gaze from the flames, his voice carrying that particular quality of thoughtfulness that indicated his mind had been working through some problem in the peculiar filing system of his consciousness. Have you ever considered the paradox of investigation during winter months? I closed my book with a soft sound, marking my place with a ribbon, though I suspected I would not return to those particular pages this evening. I cannot say the specific paradox has occurred to me, Holmes, though I imagine you are about to illuminate the matter considerably. A faint smile touched his aquiline features, barely perceptible in the firelight's uncertain illumination. The cold, my dear fellow, preserves evidence that might otherwise degrade or disappear. A footprint in snow remains crisp and clear, readable as any text. Blood does not putrefy when frozen. Documents concealed in winter quarters remain untouched by decay. Yet simultaneously, the cold obscures. It covers, it hides, it transforms familiar landscapes into alien territories where even the most observant individual might pass within feet of crucial evidence and never perceive it beneath snow's obliterating blanket. A double-edged sword, then, I offered, watching how the firelight caught and held in the planes of his face, transforming my friend into something approaching a Gothic portrait, all shadow and illuminated edge. Precisely. Preservation and concealment, existing simultaneously, each quality inseparable from the other. He fell silent then, and the quiet returned like water flowing back into footprints, filling the space our words had briefly occupied. The sound, when it came, seemed almost part of the ambient soundscape at first, a gentle knocking that might have been mistaken for branches against window panes, or snow sliding from the roof in small avalanches. But it repeated, with unmistakable intentionality, a pattern that spoke of human agency, of someone standing in the winter evening beyond our door, seeking entrance and audience. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps ascending the stairs created their own familiar rhythm, a sound heard so many times it had become woven into the very fabric of our domestic existence. Her knock upon our door maintained the gentle quality of the evening, nothing sharp or jarring to disturb the peaceful atmosphere we had cultivated. "Gentlemen," she said, opening the door just enough to lean her kindly face through the gap. "There's a Professor Ashworth here to see Mr. Holmes. I've shown him to the vestibule, but the poor man looks half frozen despite his heavy coat. Shall I send him up?" Holmes unfolded from his chair with that peculiar grace he possessed, the languid quality vanishing as interest kindled behind his eyes like flames catching fresh timber. "By all means, Mrs. Hudson, and perhaps you might prepare tea, something warming for our visitor, and for us as well. This evening calls for sustenance of the gentle variety." Our landlady withdrew, and within moments we heard heavier footsteps upon the stairs, laboured slightly as though the climber carried considerable weight. Whether of body or burden, one could not immediately determine. Holmes positioned himself near the fire, adopting that stance of welcoming attention that put visitors at ease, while simultaneously allowing him maximum observation opportunity. Professor Ashworth, when he entered our chambers, proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, though hardship or worry had etched additional decades into the lines surrounding his eyes and mouth. He wore the unmistakable clothing of academia, a well-made but slightly threadbare suit, a wool overcoat darkened by melted snow, and spectacles that had fogged immediately upon entering our warmer atmosphere. He removed these last, wiping them with a handkerchief, while blinking in that vulnerable way the severely myopic adopt when deprived of their optical assistance. "Mr. Holmes," he began, his voice carrying the cultured tones of considerable education, softened by what might have been exhaustion or distress. "I apologize for the lateness of the hour and the informality of my arrival. My name is Edmund Ashworth, Professor of Natural History at the Royal Society, specializing in Arctic expeditions and the cataloguing of northern fauna. I have come to you because I find myself confronted with a mystery that defies both scientific explanation and rational interpretation." Holmes gestured toward the chair I had recently vacated, which held position nearest the fire and would provide our guest with maximum warmth and comfort. "Please, Professor, be seated. You are most welcome here, regardless of hour or formality. Dr. Watson and I were just remarking upon the peculiar qualities of winter investigations. It seems the season has provided us with a most timely case." The professor lowered himself into the offered chair with a grateful sigh, extending his hands toward the fire's warmth. His fingers, I noted with my physician's instinct for observation, showed signs of old frostbite. The fingertips slightly discolored and blunted in that characteristic fashion that speaks of tissue damage from extreme cold. Here was a man who had experienced firsthand the environments he studied, not merely observed them from academic distance. Mrs. Hudson arrived at that moment with her customary perfect timing, bearing a tray laden with tea service, a porcelain pot from which steam rose in delicate spirals, cups and saucers painted with delicate patterns, a small plate of biscuits, and the various accompaniments that transform tea from mere beverage into ceremony. She arranged these items upon the table with practiced efficiency, nodded to our acknowledgement of her thoughtfulness, and withdrew once more, closing the door with barely a whisper of sound. I took upon myself the role of pouring, allowing Holmes to focus his complete attention upon our visitor, while ensuring everyone received their warming draught. The sound of liquid flowing from spout to cup, the gentle clink of spoon against porcelain, the whisper of steam rising. These small sounds wove themselves into the evening's peaceful tapestry. Professor Ashworth wrapped both hands around his cup, drawing warmth from the ceramic before taking a tentative sip. Colour began to return to his cheeks, and some of the tension eased from his shoulders. "I hardly know where to begin," he said softly, almost to himself. "The beginning often serves well," Holmes suggested, his tone gentle, encouraging, devoid of the impatience that sometimes characterized his interactions with less methodical minds. "Or, if not the absolute beginning, then wherever the story became strange, wherever normalcy gave way to mystery." The professor nodded slowly, gathering his thoughts, like one sorting through papers, seeking a particular document. Outside, the snow continued its silent accumulation, building London into a city of dreams, while inside our circle of firelight, a tale began to unfold that would lead us into territories far stranger than the winter streets below. 3 months ago, Professor Ashworth began, his voice taking on the measured cadence of one accustomed to lectures and presentations. An Arctic expedition returned to London from the northernmost reaches of Greenland. The expedition had been funded by the Royal Society and led by Captain Thomas Whitmore, a veteran of 7 previous polar journeys. Their mission was primarily cartographic, mapping previously uncharted coastlines, but also involved collecting specimens of Arctic wildlife, geological samples, and ethnographic observations of the indigenous peoples. He paused to take another sip of tea, and in that pause the fire crackled, sending up a small shower of sparks that danced briefly before vanishing up the chimney. The clock continued its patient counting of moments. The expedition was deemed successful by all conventional measures. Maps were completed, samples collected, journals filled with observations. But something else returned with that ship, gentlemen. Something that has caused the most extraordinary upheaval within certain circles of the scientific community. Something that has driven 3 members of the expedition into complete seclusion. And something that I believe may be connected to the disappearance of Captain Whitmore himself, who vanished from his home in Hampstead exactly 1 week ago. Holmes had gone very still, that particular stillness that indicated his complete focus, his mind already beginning to sort and categorize the information being provided. The captain disappeared from his home, you say? Under what circumstances? Under circumstances that the police have termed inconclusive, though I suspect they mean impossible, but lack the imagination to use the word. The professor's voice carried a note of frustration. He was last seen retiring to his study after dinner. His wife bade him good night at 10 o'clock, noting that he intended to work upon his expedition memoirs for perhaps another hour. The study door was locked from within. She heard him turn the key after she departed. The following morning, when he had not emerged by 9 o'clock, she grew concerned and eventually summoned servants to force the door. "And they found?" I prompted, when the professor fell silent, lost perhaps in contemplation of that terrible discovery. "They found the study empty, Watson," Holmes said softly, his eyes never leaving the professor's face. "Am I correct? The room was empty, the windows secured from inside. No sign of struggle or departure, simply an absence where a man should have been." Professor Ashworth nodded slowly, something approaching relief crossing his features at Holmes's understanding. "Precisely so, Mr. Holmes. It was as though Captain Whitmore had simply ceased to exist within that locked room. But that is not the strangest element. Upon his desk, arranged with deliberate care, they found a collection of objects that Mrs. Whitmore swears were not present the evening before. The fire shifted, settling into new configurations as consumed wood collapsed into ember and ash. The sound seemed magnified in the expectant quiet that followed the professor's words. "These objects," Holmes said, leaning forward slightly, "I suspect they related to the Arctic expedition, to whatever the party had discovered or brought back from those frozen wastes." They did, indeed. The professor reached into his coat pocket, withdrawing a small wrapped bundle. He placed this upon the table between us, with the careful deliberation of one handling something potentially dangerous. "I have brought one such object to show you, having obtained it through, well, let us say through connections within the society who share my concerns. The other items remain in police custody, but this specimen is sufficiently representative." Holmes gestured his permission, and the professor carefully unwrapped the bundle, revealing layers of cloth, then paper, then finally a curious object that gleamed dully in the firelight. At first glance, it appeared to be a small carved figure, no more than 4 inches in height, rendered in what might have been ivory or bone. But, as Holmes lifted it carefully, holding it near the lamp for better examination, the true strangeness became apparent. The figure depicted a creature that defied immediate categorization. It possessed elements that suggested mammalian origin, 4 limbs, a spine, a skull, but the proportions were somehow wrong, stretched or compressed in ways that troubled the eye. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, showing detail down to individual hair strands or scales. One could not quite determine which. Most disturbing were the eyes, rendered with tiny inset stones of some dark material that caught light and seemed to hold it, creating an illusion of actual sight, of awareness. This was found among the expedition's collected artifacts, Professor Ashworth explained, his voice dropping to an almost reverent whisper. Carved by the Inuit peoples of northern Greenland, in a village so remote that European explorers had never before made contact. The expedition ethnographer, Dr. Margaret Hollis, spent considerable time with the village elders, learning what she could of their language and customs. She was told that these figures represent creatures of legend, beings that exist at the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds, appearing only under specific circumstances of weather and astronomical alignment. I leaned closer, fascinated, despite a faint unease that crept along my spine like cold fingers. The artistic skill is remarkable, but surely, Holmes, this is merely a representation of myth. Every culture produces art depicting legendary creatures, dragons, phoenixes, and the like. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, still turning the figure in his long fingers, examining it from every angle. Yet mythologies often contain kernels of observed truth, distorted by cultural interpretation and the limitations of descriptive language. A whale, after all, might become a sea serpent in the retelling, a seal, a mermaid. But tell me, Professor, why do you believe this object, and others like it, bear connection to Captain Whitmore's disappearance? The professor retrieved his teacup, now cooled somewhat, and took a long draught, as though seeking courage in the familiar ritual. When he set the cup down, it clinked softly against the saucer, a delicate sound that seemed to mark a transition into deeper waters. Because, he said slowly, the captain had become obsessed with these legends in his final weeks. Dr. Hollis's ethnographic notes described not merely artistic traditions, but detailed testimony from village elders regarding actual sightings of these creatures, encounters that had occurred within their lifetimes, not in the distant mythological past. The creatures were called, in rough translation, those who walk between, or the threshold beings. According to the testimony Dr. Hollis recorded, these entities appear during the long Arctic night, particularly during specific celestial conditions. They move across the ice and snow without leaving tracks. They pass through solid matter as though it were fog, and they seem to possess an intense interest in human consciousness, specifically in knowledge, in understanding, in the accumulation of awareness. Holmes had set the figurine down upon the table, but his eyes remained fixed upon it, his mind clearly racing through possibilities and connections. And the expedition encountered something during their time in the Arctic, something that corresponded to these legends. Captain Whitmore claimed they had, though his account was fragmentary, difficult to follow. He spoke of lights on the ice, of shapes moving through blizzards, of a night when he stood watch and felt observed by something vast and impossibly patient. The other expedition members were more reticent, but 3 of them, including Dr. Hollis, have refused all social contact since their return, shuttering themselves in their residences and declining even visits from family. The wind outside had risen slightly, causing the snow to rattle against the window panes like sand. like whispered words in an unknown language. I rose to add another log to the fire, using the poker to arrange it properly among the glowing coals. Sparks rose in a small constellation, each point of light bright and brief as a thought. "You mentioned that objects were found upon the captain's desk," Holmes said, returning to that crucial detail. "Aside from figurines like this, what else was discovered?" Professor Ashworth drew a small notebook from his inner pocket, opening it to reveal pages covered in neat handwriting. According to the inventory provided by Inspector Gregson, I believe you know him, Mr. Holmes, the desk contained the following: 3 carved figures similar to the one I've shown you, a leather journal written in a combination of English and what appears to be Inuit language, a small sealed vial containing fragments of what might be ice or crystal, a compass that Mrs. Whitmore swears is not the one her husband normally used, and a map. The map depicted what? Holmes asked, his interest clearly piqued by this particular item. That is precisely the mystery within the mystery. The map shows the coastline where the expedition worked, but it includes markings and annotations that do not appear in the official cartographic records. It suggests the existence of geographical features, caves, formations, perhaps structures, that were never documented in the expedition's formal reports. Captain Whitmore appears to have conducted private explorations that he concealed from his fellow expedition members. Holmes rose from his chair, pacing toward the window, where he stood with hands clasped behind his back, gazing out at the snow-transformed street below. His profile caught the light, rendering him momentarily statuesque, a figure of thought made flesh. "Professor Ashworth, I must ask you a question that may seem peculiar, but I assure you it bears relevance. In your expertise regarding Arctic fauna, have you ever encountered reliable reports of creatures that defy standard taxonomic classification? Animals or entities that seem to bridge categories in ways that trouble conventional biological understanding?" The professor considered this question with the seriousness it deserved, his academic training evident in the thoughtful pause before response. "The Arctic is a realm of extremes, Mr. Holmes, and life adapts to extremes in remarkable ways. I have catalogued fish that survive being frozen solid, their bodies producing antifreeze compounds that would seem impossible by ordinary physiological standards. I have observed bears whose hunting patterns suggest intelligence far beyond what we typically attribute to animals. I have heard testimony from indigenous peoples regarding creatures that appear only during specific environmental conditions. Animals that might hibernate or migrate in patterns we do not yet understand, making them seem to vanish and reappear as though crossing from one state of existence to another. Whether this extends to entities that are genuinely paranormal, I cannot scientifically attest, but I can say with certainty that the Arctic keeps secrets, and that human knowledge of those regions remains fragmentary at best." Holmes turned from the window, and I could see that particular expression upon his face. The look that indicated a case had caught his imagination, had presented the kind of puzzle that engaged his full, formidable intellect. "I shall take your case, Professor. Moreover, I believe Dr. Watson and I must conduct our investigation with some urgency, as I suspect Captain Whitmore's disappearance is not an isolated incident, but rather part of a larger pattern. Tell me, has anyone else connected to the expedition experienced unusual occurrences since the captain's vanishing?" The professor's face grew even graver. "Yesterday morning, Dr. Hollis's landlady found the door to her rooms standing open. Dr. Hollis was gone, and like Captain Whitmore, she had left behind a collection of Arctic artifacts arranged upon her desk, including a journal filled with drawings of landscapes that no one recognized. Rendered in such detail, they must surely depict actual locations, yet appearing in no official expedition documentation. The clock chose that moment to chime the hour, its mellow tones marking the passage into deeper evening. The sound seemed to acknowledge the gravity of what we were undertaking, to mark the moment when a peaceful, snowy night transformed into something approaching quest or crusade. "I shall need to examine the captain's study," Holmes said decisively, "and, if possible, Dr. Hollis's rooms as well, before whatever evidence remains becomes further compromised. Professor, can you arrange access through your connections with the Royal Society and the families involved?" "I can and will," the professor replied, rising from his chair with renewed energy, the paralysis of fear and confusion giving way to the relief of action. "Shall I call upon you tomorrow morning?" "Please do. Come at 9 o'clock, and we shall proceed from here." Holmes moved to show our visitor to the door, but paused, turning back to retrieve the carved figure from the table. "With your permission, I should like to retain this specimen overnight for examination. I wish to study it more closely, perhaps conduct some tests that might reveal more about its composition and crafting. Of course, Mr. Holmes, I entrust it to your care completely." The professor wrapped himself once more in his heavy coat, preparing to return to the cold evening. "I cannot express adequately my gratitude for your willingness to engage with a matter that many would dismiss as fancy or delusion. Captain Whitmore was a friend, you understand, a colleague and companion on 2 previous expeditions. I owe him whatever effort I can muster toward discovering his fate. We shall endeavour to provide answers," Holmes assured him, "though I confess I cannot yet predict what form those answers shall take. The Arctic, as you noted, keeps its secrets well. Our task shall be to coax forth truth even from that realm of ice and silence." After the professor departed, his footsteps descending the stairs and fading into the snowy night beyond, Holmes and I remained standing in the warming glow of our chambers, the carved figure resting upon the table between us, like a small totem from another world entirely. "Well, Watson," Holmes said softly, returning to his chair and taking up the figure once more, "it appears our comfortable winter evening has evolved into something considerably more complex. What is your initial assessment?" I resumed my own seat, grateful to be included in this preliminary analysis, as I had been in so many cases past. The ritual of our discussion felt as comfortable as the chair itself, a familiar intellectual dance we had perfected over years of collaboration. "I confess I am torn between rational and fanciful interpretations, Holmes. The rational explanation suggests some form of collective delusion among the expedition members, perhaps induced by the extreme environment and isolation, manifesting as consistent hallucinations of these mythical creatures. The disappearances, while strange, might be explained through perfectly ordinary means: elopement, suicide concealed by removal of bodies, even staged vanishing for personal reasons we cannot yet fathom." "And the fanciful interpretation?" Holmes prompted, though I detected a glimmer of something in his eyes, amusement perhaps, or approval at my willingness to articulate even unlikely possibilities. "That something genuinely anomalous exists in those Arctic wastes, something that the indigenous peoples have long observed and incorporated into their cultural framework through these legends, and that the expedition members encountered this phenomenon in ways that have somehow marked them, for lack of a better term, made them targets or subjects of continued attention from these entities, that the disappearances represent not ordinary criminal acts, but something approaching abduction by forces that operate according to rules we do not yet comprehend. Holmes nodded slowly, setting the figure upon the mantelpiece, where the firelight could play across its carved surfaces. Both interpretations have merit, and both present investigable hypotheses. Tomorrow, we shall begin the methodical work of evidence gathering, location examination, witness testimony, all the conventional tools of detection. But tonight, I think we would be wise to prepare ourselves mentally for the possibility that this case may lead us into territories where conventional assumptions require adjustment. He reached for his pipe, filling it with tobacco from the Persian slipper that served as his tobacco pouch. The familiar ritual seemed to anchor us both, a connection to normalcy, even as we contemplated possibilities that stretched normalcy's boundaries. Soon the room filled with fragrant smoke, adding another layer to the evening's sensory atmosphere. "I intend to sit up for some hours," Holmes announced, examining this figure more closely and reviewing what literature we possess regarding Arctic exploration and indigenous belief systems. "You should seek your rest, Watson. Tomorrow may prove demanding in ways we cannot yet anticipate." I recognized the dismissal for what it was, not rejection, but consideration, Holmes's way of protecting my rest, even as he sacrificed his own to the demands of the puzzle before him. Very well, though I confess I doubt sleep shall come easily tonight. My mind shall be full of ice and mystery. "Then perhaps," Holmes suggested with a slight smile, "you might direct those thoughts toward our previous cases, comfortable mental territory you have traversed many times before. Let those familiar pathways guide you towards sleep, Watson. The Arctic mysteries shall wait until morning. They have waited centuries already. A few hours more shall not diminish them." I retired to my room, leaving Holmes surrounded by books pulled from shelves, the carved figure watching from the mantelpiece with its impossible eyes, and the snow falling endlessly beyond the windows. As I prepared for bed, I could hear the occasional sound from the sitting room, the turning of pages, the scratch of pencil against paper, the soft crack of the fire being fed. These sounds followed me into dreams, where they transformed into the grinding of ice floes, the whisper of Arctic winds, and the patient breathing of something vast and old, waiting in frozen darkness. Morning arrived with that peculiar quality of light that only snow can create, a brightness that seemed to come from all directions at once, reflected and re-reflected until the very air glowed. I woke to find that the storm had passed during the night, leaving London transformed into a crystalline wonderland where every surface sparkled with frost, and the sky showed clear pale blue, washed clean by winter's passage. Descending to our sitting room, I found Holmes still awake, or awake again. I could not determine which. He stood at the window, cup of coffee in hand, gazing down at Baker Street, where early morning vendors and workers carved paths through snow that reached nearly to the tops of their boots. He had changed his clothing, suggesting he had at least briefly attended to personal maintenance, though his face showed the slight hollow quality that came from too little rest. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me without turning from the window. Mrs. Hudson has prepared breakfast, and I have already consumed my portion, but yours awaits on the covered dish there. I recommend you eat well. The day ahead promises to be lengthy. I lifted the cover to find eggs, toast, and kippers, still pleasantly warm. The smell was comforting, grounding, a connection to ordinary life, even as we prepared to investigate extraordinary circumstances. Did your nocturnal studies prove illuminating? I asked between bites. Suggestive, certainly. Illuminating may be too strong a term. He turned from the window at last, carrying his coffee to the chair and folding himself into it with that peculiar grace. The figure is carved from walrus ivory, which is unremarkable for Inuit craftsmanship. However, the level of detail is extraordinary, even by the standards of their finest artisans. More intriguing, the inset eyes appear to be fragments of meteoric iron, extraterrestrial material. The use of such material in indigenous crafts is documented, but rare, typically reserved for objects of special ceremonial or spiritual significance. So the figure represents something important within their cultural framework, I concluded. Indeed, moreover, my review of Arctic exploration literature revealed scattered references across multiple expeditions to unusual phenomena observed during specific conditions, references that are remarkably consistent despite spanning decades and involving observers with no contact with one another. Lights upon the ice, described variously as aurora-like, but behaving differently. Shapes glimpsed at the boundaries of vision during storms. A pervasive sense of being observed when no humans were present for miles. Most intriguingly, several expeditions report compasses behaving erratically in certain locations, even accounting for magnetic pole proximity and iron deposits. Before I could respond, a knock sounded at our door. Mrs. Hudson announcing Professor Ashworth's arrival, punctual to the minute Holmes had specified. Our visitor entered, looking somewhat improved from the previous evening, though worry still creased his features. "Good morning, gentlemen. I have arranged everything as you requested. Mrs. Whitmore will receive us at the house in Hampstead at 10 o'clock. Dr. Hollis's landlady, Mrs. Patterson, has agreed to allow us access to the rooms this afternoon. Inspector Gregson sends his regards and notes that while he considers the case highly irregular, he respects your methods sufficiently to grant you latitude in examination." "Excellent work, Professor." Holmes rose, moving toward the hooks where his coat and scarf hung waiting. "Watson, gather your medical bag, if you would. I have a peculiar intuition that your professional expertise may prove relevant before the day concludes." We prepared ourselves for the winter weather. Heavy coats, scarves wrapped multiple times around necks and faces, gloves and hats that could be pulled low against wind. Thus, armoured against the cold, we descended to Baker Street, where the professor had arranged for a carriage. The horse that drew it stood patient in the snow, its breath creating small clouds in the frigid air, frost forming on its muzzle, where condensation met bitter temperature. The journey to Hampstead carried us through streets that seemed almost foreign in their transformed state. Snow had simplified London's complexity, reducing its infinite shades of grey and brown to clean whites and stark shadows. People moved carefully, mindful of ice hidden beneath snow, and the normal cacophony of city life remained muted, softened by the insulating blanket nature had provided. Inside the carriage, the three of us sat in companionable near silence, broken only by occasional observations from the professor regarding the expedition or its members. Holmes listened with that quality of attention that missed nothing, his eyes half closed, but his mind clearly active, sorting and categorizing information against frameworks of understanding he had spent a lifetime developing. "Tell me about Dr. Hollis," Holmes requested, as our carriage climbed toward Hampstead's higher elevations. "Her background, her expertise, her temperament. Paint me a picture of the woman beyond her academic credentials." Professor Ashworth considered this, his gloved hands folded in his lap. "Margaret Hollis is, or was, I should perhaps say, given her current withdrawn state, one of the most remarkable ethnographers of our generation. She possesses an extraordinary gift for language acquisition and cultural interpretation. More importantly, she approaches indigenous peoples with genuine respect and curiosity, rather than the colonial condescension that mars so much anthropological work. The Inuit communities responded to her with unusual openness, sharing traditions and knowledge they typically guard closely from European intrusion. She is 42 years old, unmarried by choice, devoted entirely to her work with an intensity that some find disconcerting, but I have always admired. "And her relationship with Captain Whitmore?" Holmes asked, his tone neutral, but his interest evident. "Professional and cordial. If you are wondering whether romantic attachment might explain some element of these events, I can state with confidence that no such connection existed. Dr. Hollis's passions are entirely intellectual and scientific." The carriage slowed, turning onto a street lined with substantial homes set back behind iron fences and snow-covered gardens. Hampstead maintained its village-like quality, even as London sprawled ever outward, and the Whitmore residence proved to be a handsome brick structure of Georgian vintage, 3 stories tall with ivy trained along its front face, now draped with snow that clung to every leaf and stem. A housemaid answered our knock, admitting us to a hallway tiled in black and white marble, cold despite a fire visible through an open doorway. She took our coats with practiced efficiency, hanging them where snow could drip onto mat rather than fine carpet, and announced our presence to Mrs. Whitmore, who emerged from what appeared to be a morning room. The captain's wife was a woman of perhaps 45, dressed in subdued colours that suggested mourning without fully embracing it. Not black, but deep charcoal, not funeral, but serious. Her face showed the particular kind of exhaustion that comes not from physical exertion, but from sustained emotional strain, from sleep interrupted by worry and days weighted with uncertainty. "Mr. Holmes," she said, extending her hand, which he took gently, "Professor Ashworth has written to me about you, explaining his confidence in your abilities. I confess I am torn between hope that you might discover what has happened to my husband, and fear of what such discovery might entail. But I am resolved to know truth, whatever form it takes. Please, come through to Thomas's study." She led us deeper into the house, through corridors hung with maritime paintings, and decorated with various artifacts from the captain's long career. Whalebones, strange shells, instruments of navigation rendered decorative by obsolescence. The house possessed that peculiar atmosphere of a dwelling whose heart has stopped beating, whose animating presence has been removed, leaving only the husk of routine to maintain appearance of ongoing life. The study door stood open, revealing a room that clearly served as masculine sanctuary within this domestic space. Dark wood panelling rose to picture rail height, above which walls were painted a deep green that absorbed and held light. bookshelves filled with volumes regarding exploration, navigation, natural history, and maritime adventure lined 2 walls. A large desk dominated the space before windows that overlooked the snow-covered garden. The fireplace remained cold, no warmth having been lit here since the captain's disappearance, and the room's chill went beyond merely physical temperature. The objects were here, Mrs. Whitmore said softly, gesturing toward the desk, where now only ordinary items remained. Pen and ink, blotter, letter holder. Arranged in a circle, each spaced exactly the same distance from its neighbours. The police took them for examination, though I cannot imagine what examinations might prove revelatory. Holmes approached the desk with the slow deliberation of one entering a sacred space, his eyes moving across every surface, every item, every inch of the room with that systematic thoroughness that characterized his method. He drew a small magnifying lens from his pocket, examining the desktop minutely, particularly the area where Mrs. Whitmore had indicated the objects had been placed. The room was locked from within, he said, his voice carrying a thoughtful quality. You heard the key turn after you bade him good night, and the key was found still in the lock from the inside when servants forced entry the following morning. Is that precisely correct? It is, Mr. Holmes. Thomas often locked the door when working on his memoirs or correspondence. He said the knowledge of seclusion helped him think more clearly, freed his mind from the subconscious, listening for interruption. And the windows? Holmes moved toward these as he spoke, examining their frames and the latches that secured them. I watched Holmes work, recognizing the signs of his mind fully engaged with puzzle elements, testing possibilities against physical evidence, discarding theories that failed to account for observed fact. He dropped to hands and knees at one point, examining the floor beneath the desk with his lens, then moved to the fireplace, where he studied the cold hearth and chimney opening. Professor Ashworth, he called without rising from his examination. You mentioned a compass was found among the objects. Can you describe it? The professor withdrew his notebook, consulting his notes from the police inventory. Brass construction, approximately 3 inches in diameter, appears to be of antique design, though in excellent condition. The face shows not merely cardinal directions, but additional markings, symbols that Mrs. Whitmore states she does not recognize, and that do not appear on her husband's usual compass. Curious, Holmes murmured, finally rising and dusting his hands. Mrs. Whitmore, did your husband speak to you about his work on the expedition memoirs? Did he share any of his impressions or experiences from the Arctic journey? She moved to the cold fireplace, gazing into its emptiness as though seeking warmth from memory rather than flame. He was troubled by something he had experienced, but seemed reluctant to speak plainly about it. He mentioned several times, feeling that the expedition had touched something they did not fully understand, had stirred waters better, left calm. He spoke of Dr. Hollis's research among the Inuit communities, saying she had documented beliefs regarding creatures or entities that existed at the margins of reality. His exact phrase was margins of reality, and that he feared she had given these legends more credence than scientific objectivity should allow. Yet, he included artifacts related to these legends among his personal effects, Holmes observed, suggesting his own credence had been affected, perhaps despite his intentions. I believe so, yes. The Thomas who returned from the Arctic was changed from the man who departed. Not drastically, our daily life continued much as it had before, but in subtle ways. He would stand at windows, looking out at nothing I could perceive. He slept poorly, waking often from dreams he would not describe. And he began, I hesitate to mention this, as it sounds quite mad, but he began speaking occasionally of feeling watched, of sensing attention from something that existed just beyond the threshold of normal perception. The room fell silent after this revelation, the weight of her words seeming to fill the space. Outside, a bird called, some winter sparrow seeking others of its kind, the sound piercing and lonely in the cold morning. Holmes turned from his examination of the room, his expression thoughtful. Mrs. Whitmore, I would like to examine your husband's expedition materials, his journals, photographs, any specimens or artifacts he brought back that remain here rather than being deposited with the Royal Society. Would that be possible? Of course. He kept most such items in the attic, in trunks specifically for expedition storage. I can have them brought down, or you are welcome to examine them there. The attic would be preferable, if we might trouble you for access. Sometimes, the context in which items are stored proves as revealing as the items themselves. Mrs. Whitmore led us from the study, back through the house, to a narrow staircase that climbed steeply toward the upper reaches of the residence. The attic proved to be a large space beneath slanting rooflines, illuminated by dormers that filled the area with cold, clear light reflecting from snow. The space was well organized, various possessions stored systematically in labeled trunks and boxes, the accumulated archaeology of a family's life. 2 large trunks bore labels indicating Arctic Expedition, Greenland, in neat script. Holmes knelt before these, opening the first to reveal the organized chaos of expedition life. Journals wrapped in oilcloth, boxes of photographic plates, specimen containers, rolled maps, instruments in padded cases. The smell that emerged was distinctive: salt and ice, leather and metal, with undertones of something wild and indefinable. For the next hour, Holmes conducted a systematic examination of the trunk's contents, while I assisted by organizing examined materials and making notes as he dictated observations. Professor Ashworth proved invaluable in identifying specimens and interpreting scientific notation in the journals. Mrs. Whitmore remained with us initially, then withdrew, leaving us to our work with instructions to call if we required anything. The journals proved particularly fascinating. Captain Whitmore wrote with clarity and precision, his entries documenting daily activities, observations, measurements, and reflections. But as Holmes worked through the chronological sequence, a pattern emerged. The early entries maintained strict scientific objectivity, but somewhere in the middle period, during the weeks the expedition spent in contact with the most remote Inuit community, the tone began to shift. Observations became more speculative. Descriptions of indigenous beliefs received increasingly lengthy and detailed treatment. And finally, in entries dated to the last month of the expedition, the captain began recording his own experiences of unusual phenomena. "Listen to this, Watson," Holmes said, reading aloud from a journal entry dated to 3 weeks before the expedition's departure from Greenland. "Last night during my watch, the aurora displayed with unusual intensity, though not in the familiar curtains and ribbons. Instead, the lights seemed to coalesce into forms, shapes that suggested intention, organization, even perhaps consciousness. Dr. Hollis has been adamant that we record all observations objectively, and so I note what I saw. The lights formed patterns resembling the symbols the Inuit carve into their ceremonial objects. Patterns Dr. Hollis has photographed extensively. The formations held for several minutes each, then flowed into new configurations, as though the sky itself were communicating through a grammar of light. When I mentioned this to Dr. Hollis this morning, she became quite animated and insisted we conduct a ceremony the Inuit shaman has offered to perform. A ritual of acknowledgement, she called it. A way of indicating we understand we are being observed by forces we do not fully comprehend, but which we respect. Did they conduct this ceremony? I asked, fascinated despite myself by the captain's account. Holmes turned pages carefully. It appears they did, 3 days later. The entry describes a ritual involving specific songs, offerings placed upon the ice, and the creation of symbols in snow using powdered ash and coloured materials. The captain writes, I participated with the scientific detachment appropriate to anthropological observation, but I confess the experience affected me beyond mere academic interest. During the ceremony, which lasted perhaps 2 hours and was conducted beneath clear skies with full moon and aurora both present, I experienced a sensation difficult to describe in precise terms. It was as though my consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of my body, as though I could perceive vast distances and sense presences that exist in dimensions adjacent to our normal 3-dimensional experience. Dr. Hollis later confided she felt something similar, as did 2 other expedition members who participated. We are unsure what to make of these shared sensations. The shaman, through Dr. Hollis's translation, stated that we had been seen by the threshold beings, acknowledged by them as conscious entities worthy of notice, and that this acknowledgement carried both honour and responsibility. The attic had grown colder as we worked, or perhaps the content of what we read had introduced its own chill. I found myself pulling my coat tighter, though we remained indoors and theoretically protected from the winter beyond the walls. Professor Ashworth spoke quietly, his voice carrying a troubled note. I did not know the expedition had participated in indigenous ceremonies. Such details were not included in the official reports to the Royal Society. Captain Whitmore must have deliberately omitted them, perhaps fearing ridicule or questions about scientific propriety. Yet he documented them thoroughly in his personal journals, Holmes observed, suggesting he considered them significant, even if not suitable for official reporting. Let us examine the photographic plates. Visual evidence may prove illuminating. The plates were stored in protective boxes, each carefully labelled with date and subject. Holmes held them up to the light streaming through the dormer windows, examining negative images that depicted expedition life, landscapes of stunning desolation, portraits of Inuit community members, and various artifacts and locations. Many plates showed nothing unusual, standard expedition documentation, but several plates from the later period of the journey showed something quite different. Watson, Professor, look at this sequence, Holmes instructed, arranging 5 plates in chronological order against the light. The images depicted what appeared to be the same location, a formation of ice and rock on a barren coast, photographed at different times as evidenced by changing shadows. But in 3 of the 5 images, faint additional forms appeared in the background, forms that suggested shape and structure, but remained frustratingly ambiguous, refusing to resolve into definite identity. Photographic artifact, I suggested. Some flaw in the development process? Possibly, Holmes agreed. though note that the forms appear in images from different plates, developed presumably at different times, and observe how the forms seem to maintain consistent shape across the multiple photographs, suggesting they represent actual objects or entities, rather than random development errors. We descended from the attic as church bells somewhere in Hampstead announced noon, their tones carrying clearly through the cold air. Mrs. Whitmore had arranged a simple luncheon for us: bread, cheese, cold meats, tea, which we consumed in the dining room while discussing our findings thus far. The expedition clearly experienced something unusual, Holmes summarized between bites. Whether that something was genuinely anomalous or represented a combination of environmental factors producing shared misperception remains to be determined. The disappearances of Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis, however, require explanation grounded in physical possibility. People do not simply vanish from locked rooms or secured apartments, regardless of what mysterious experiences they may have had weeks prior. Unless, Professor Ashworth said quietly, the experiences created conditions that made such disappearances possible. Unless the threshold beings, if they exist, marked the expedition members in some fashion that allows them to cross boundaries that normally remain solid, to move between states of existence in ways that defy our usual understanding of physical law. Professor, Holmes said gently but firmly, while I do not dismiss the possibility of phenomena beyond current scientific understanding, investigation requires we exhaust conventional explanations before embracing extraordinary ones. There is much we do not yet know about this case. Let us proceed to Dr. Hollis's former rooms and see what evidence awaits us there. Our afternoon journey took us from Hampstead back toward central London to a respectable building in Bloomsbury where many academics maintained residence. The landlady, Mrs. Patterson, awaited our arrival and proved to be a woman of middle years with the sharp observational skills of one who has spent decades managing property and tenants. Dr. Hollis was a model tenant, she informed us, while leading us up narrow stairs toward the third floor. Quiet, punctual with rent, thoughtful about not disturbing other residents, though she became quite reclusive after returning from her expedition. She had always been sociable enough before, greeting others in the halls, occasionally attending the building's social gatherings. But these last months, she barely left her rooms except for necessities. Did she have visitors? Holmes inquired as we climbed. Almost none. The professor here came several times. She nodded toward Professor Ashworth, and a few colleagues from the Royal Society, but she turned most callers away, claiming she was too engaged with her work to spare time for socializing. I worried about her, truth be told. She seemed haunted is perhaps too dramatic a word, but troubled certainly, preoccupied with matters that weighed upon her spirit. The door to Dr. Hollis's rooms stood locked, and Mrs. Patterson produced a key ring, sorting through until she found the correct one. I haven't disturbed anything since the police finished their examination. It seemed wrong, somehow, to immediately rent out the rooms when Dr. Hollis might yet return. The rooms revealed themselves as we entered. A small sitting room that doubled as workspace, a bedroom barely glimpsed through a partially open door, and presumably a small kitchen facility, though we did not immediately explore that direction. The sitting room was dominated by a large desk positioned near windows that overlooked the street below. The surfaces were covered with papers, books, photographs, and objects, an explosion of scholarly activity suggesting intense, perhaps obsessive, research. But most striking was the wall above the desk, which Dr. Hollis had covered with what appeared to be a massive diagram or chart. Photographs were pinned in careful arrangements, connected by lines of string or drawn connections. Symbols copied from Inuit artifacts formed patterns around the photographs. Text in both English and what I assumed to be Inuit language filled spaces between images. The overall effect was of a map, but a map depicting what territory or relationship remained unclear. Holmes approached this wall assemblage with barely suppressed excitement, his eyes moving rapidly across the various elements, seeking pattern and meaning within complexity. "Watson, Professor, observe this. Dr. Hollis has created a visual representation of relationships she perceived. Perhaps relationships between experiences, locations, artifacts, and beliefs. This is extraordinarily valuable data, a window directly into her analytical process." He began photographing the wall arrangement with a small camera he had brought for this purpose, ensuring we would have a complete record of Dr. Hollis's work. Meanwhile, I examined the papers on the desk, discovering journal entries, drafted letters never sent, and pages of translation work, where Dr. Hollis had laboriously rendered Inuit phrases into English, often with multiple alternative translations, suggesting the complexity of meaning. One journal entry in particular caught my attention. I read it aloud for the others. "I am increasingly convinced that the threshold beings are not mythological constructs, but actual entities, perhaps not in the strictly physical sense, but real nonetheless in their own mode of existence. They appear to be drawn to consciousness itself, to awareness and intelligence. The shamanic traditions suggest they existed long before humans, that they are patient observers who occasionally choose to interact with those they find sufficiently developed in understanding. The ceremony on the ice was not mere ritual, but actual communication, an exchange of recognition. Since that night, I have felt their attention, not constantly, but in moments when my awareness is most acute. It is not frightening so much as overwhelming, like being noticed by something vast and fundamentally other. Captain Whitmore feels it too, though he is more disturbed by the sensation than I am. I have been studying methods the Inuit use to enter into more direct communication, to invite deeper contact. I believe I am close to understanding how to construct a threshold, a deliberate opening through which exchange might occur. The room fell silent as the implications of this passage settled over us. Holmes ceased his photographing and turned to face me fully. "When is that entry dated?" I checked the page header. 4 days before her disappearance. "And the arrangement on the wall?" Professor Ashworth said softly, moving closer to examine it. "Look at the center, that photograph there." He pointed to an image that appeared to show a landscape of ice and rock. "That location, I recognize it from Captain Whitmore's plates. That is the site where they conducted the ceremony Dr. Hollis mentioned." Holmes extracted a magnifying lens, examining the photograph closely. Around its edges, Dr. Hollis had written in tiny script, "Threshold coordinates, winter solstice, invitation extended, awaiting acknowledgement." "Watson," Holmes said quietly, "what is today's date?" I had to think for a moment, the days having blurred together somewhat during our investigation. "December 20th, Holmes. Why?" "Because the winter solstice occurs tomorrow. And if Dr. Hollis believed she had constructed some form of invitation, or communication method tied to specific astronomical timing, then tomorrow night represents the window she was anticipating. The implications hung in the air between us, like frost crystals catching light. Outside, the afternoon was already beginning its decline toward evening, the winter sun preparing to set early, as it did during this darkest season. Professor Ashworth spoke with a mixture of hope and trepidation. "Do you believe they went somewhere deliberately, Mr. Holmes? That these disappearances were not abductions or murders, but conscious departures, crossings into some other state or location?" "I believe," Holmes said carefully, "that both Dr. Hollis and Captain Whitmore were investigating something they believed to be real and significant. Whether their beliefs corresponded to actual anomalous phenomena, or represented a shared delusion born of extreme environment and cultural immersion, remains the central question. But if they acted on their beliefs, if they attempted to create conditions for contact or transition, then their disappearances may indeed have been voluntary, at least in origin." "But that raises an obvious question," I interjected. "If they went somewhere or into some state voluntarily, how did they manage to vanish from locked rooms? What mechanism could possibly allow a person to bypass doors and windows?" Holmes returned to examining the wall arrangement, his finger tracing the string connections between various elements. "Consider the testimony from the Inuit traditions that Dr. Hollis recorded so extensively. The threshold beings are described as able to move through matter, to exist partially in our dimension and partially in others. If, and I stress if, Watson, as this remains hypothetical, if consciousness under specific conditions could achieve a similar state, could shift its relationship to physical matter." He trailed off, but the thought was clear enough. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature. "Are you suggesting," Professor Ashworth said, his voice barely above a whisper, "that they learned how to pass through walls? That human consciousness can be trained or altered to achieve what these legends describe?" "I am suggesting nothing definite at present, merely exploring possibilities that account for the evidence before us. But consider, we have locked room disappearances. We have testimony regarding entities that seemingly defy physical constraints. We have documented attempts by intelligent observers to understand and replicate conditions for contact with these entities. And we have timing aligned with astronomical events emphasized in indigenous traditions. These elements form a pattern, though what that pattern represents, delusion or discovery, remains to be determined." We spent the remainder of the afternoon at Dr. Hollis's rooms, carefully documenting everything we found. Holmes made detailed sketches of the wall arrangement to supplement his photographs. I copied extensive passages from journals, particularly those describing the ceremony on the ice and Dr. Hollis's subsequent researches into communication methods. Professor Ashworth examined various Inuit artifacts Dr. Hollis had brought back, carved figures similar to the one we had already seen, but also masks, ceremonial tools, and objects whose purpose remained obscure. As evening approached, painting the windows with deepening blue, we concluded our work and prepared to depart. Mrs. Patterson, who had remained nearby throughout our examination, asked quietly whether we believed Dr. Hollis would return. "I honestly cannot say," Holmes told her with gentle honesty, "but I believe she is pursuing something she considers of utmost importance, and that wherever she has gone, she has not been taken against her will." We emerged into winter evening, the street lamps beginning their warm glow against the gathering darkness. The carriage ride back to Baker Street occurred largely in silence, each of us lost in contemplation of what we had discovered and what it might mean. Upon returning to our chambers, we found Mrs. Hudson had maintained the fire beautifully and left cold supper under covered dishes. Holmes immediately set about organizing our findings, spreading photographs and notes across every available surface, creating his own version of Dr. Hollis's wall arrangement, seeking patterns within patterns. I prepared tea, that most English of responses to strangeness and uncertainty, and we settled into our chairs with cups and silence. The clock ticked, the fire crackled. Outside, London moved through its evening routines, oblivious to mysteries that touch the borders of reality itself. "Tomorrow is the solstice," Holmes finally said, breaking our contemplative quiet. If Dr. Hollis's theories have any validity, if the indigenous knowledge she studied contains actual truth rather than metaphorical wisdom, then tomorrow night represents a significant moment, a threshold time, if you will, when the boundaries between states might become more permeable. "What are you proposing, Holmes?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew. "I am proposing that we conduct an experiment, that we attempt to recreate, as closely as possible, given our London location and limited resources, the conditions Dr. Hollis believed would facilitate contact or transition. If nothing occurs, we will have our answer. The entire matter is delusion, and the disappearances must have mundane explanations we have not yet discovered. But if something does occur, we might disappear ourselves," I finished. "Holmes, this seems extraordinarily dangerous, venturing into territories we do not understand, based on theories that may be entirely fanciful. And yet," he countered gently, "is it not our purpose to investigate mysteries wherever they lead, to seek truth, even when that truth challenges our comfortable assumptions? I do not propose we take foolish risks, Watson, but I do suggest that we position ourselves as observers at the threshold, so to speak, during tomorrow night's solstice moment. We need not attempt to cross any boundary, merely to observe whether boundaries truly exist in forms different from our usual understanding." I considered this, sipping my tea, feeling its warmth spread through my chest. The proposal frightened me, I confess freely, but it also called to that part of me that had always been drawn to adventure, to the unknown, to standing beside Sherlock Holmes as he pushed against the edges of human knowledge. "Very well," I agreed. "I am with you, as always. What preparations do we need to make?" Holmes smiled, a genuine expression of warmth and gratitude. "We will need to create a controlled environment, incorporating elements that Dr. Hollis believed significant. The carved figures, specific symbols, perhaps certain sound frequencies, if we can approximate the shamanic songs she documented. We will need astronomical calculations to determine the precise solstice moment for our longitude and latitude. And we will need to maintain scientific objectivity, documenting everything we observe or experience without allowing imagination to embellish actual phenomena." We spent the evening planning and preparing, working together with the comfortable coordination of long partnership. Holmes performed calculations, consulting astronomical tables and maps. I reviewed Dr. Hollis's journal entries regarding the ceremony, extracting details about positioning, materials, and ritual elements. Professor Ashworth, whom Holmes had invited to join us via messenger, arrived as the clock approached 10, carrying additional artifacts from the Royal Society's collections. "I could not let you undertake this alone," the professor explained. "Whatever happens tomorrow night, I wish to witness it. Captain Whitmore was my friend, and Dr. Hollis my colleague. If there is any possibility of understanding their fate, I must be present." Holmes clasped his shoulder warmly. "Your presence is welcome, Professor. We venture together into the unknown, armed with reason and observation, guided by scientific method, even when investigating phenomena that may challenge science itself." We worked late into the night, our sitting room gradually transforming into something between laboratory and ceremonial space. The carved figures were positioned at specific points, corresponding to cardinal and intercardinal directions. Holmes had drawn symbols copied from Dr. Hollis's wall arrangement onto paper, placing these at intervals around the room's perimeter. We had moved most furniture to create an open central space, though we maintained our chairs near the fire for comfort during the long wait ahead. Finally, as midnight approached, we deemed our preparations complete. Professor Ashworth departed for his own lodgings, with plans to return the following evening at 9 o'clock, well before the calculated solstice moment, at approximately 11:43. Holmes and I remained in our transformed chambers, regarding what we had created with a mixture of scientific curiosity and something approaching awe. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Holmes said softly, gazing at the arrangement we had constructed, "we will at least have pursued truth as far as our courage and methodology can take us. There are mysteries in this world, Watson, that may exceed our current capacity for understanding. But the attempt to understand, that noble effort itself, defines us as seekers of knowledge." I retired to my room eventually, though sleep came with difficulty. My mind circled endlessly around questions without answers, around the boundaries between possible and impossible, around the image of Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis vanishing from locked rooms, perhaps crossing into spaces we could not perceive or even properly imagine. Dreams, when they finally came, carried me across landscapes of ice beneath skies filled with impossible lights, while vast patient presences watched from distances that were simultaneously infinite and intimate. The day of the winter solstice arrived with heavy grey skies that promised snow without yet delivering it. The light possessed that peculiar quality of minimal brightness, as though the world had been turned down like a lamp, conserved against the darkness that would soon reclaim its seasonal dominance. This was the longest night of the year, the moment when darkness achieved its maximum reach before slowly, inexorably beginning its retreat. I woke late, having slept poorly and fitfully. Descending to our sitting room, I found Holmes already awake and occupied with final preparations. He had slept even less than I, judging by the multiple coffee cups scattered about and the intensity of his focus. Yet he showed no signs of fatigue, animated instead by the anticipation of investigation reaching its culminating moment. "Good morning, Watson," he greeted me with uncharacteristic cheer. Or perhaps good longest day would be more accurate. "I trust you rested adequately despite the peculiar circumstances we face tonight." "Adequately enough," I replied, moving to prepare my own coffee. "Have you been working all night, Holmes?" "Not continuously, but I confess to intermittent wakefulness. I have been reviewing all our evidence, ensuring we have not overlooked any crucial element. I have also been studying shamanic traditions from various cultures, seeking common elements in their approaches to altered states of consciousness and perception of non-ordinary reality. The similarities across cultures that never contacted one another prove quite striking, Watson. Either all humans share certain neurological patterns that produce consistent hallucinations, or else these traditions independently discovered genuine phenomena that exist outside normal sensory perception. Mrs. Hudson arrived with our breakfast, seeming determinedly oblivious to the unusual arrangements in our sitting room, the symbols, the artifacts, the cleared central space. She had long since learned not to question the eccentricities of her tenants, accepting mystery as part of her professional environment. Her normality was comforting, a reminder that ordinary life continued regardless of our ventures into the extraordinary. The day passed slowly, waited with anticipation. Holmes occupied himself with correspondence and minor chemical experiments at his table. I attempted to read, but found concentration elusive, my eyes passing over words without comprehension. We spoke little, comfortable in shared silence, each managing pre-investigation nerves in our own way. As afternoon declined into evening, the promised snow began to fall, light flakes that drifted rather than fell, visible against the darkening sky like stars detached from their celestial moorings. The city grew quiet, as it had during the previous snowfalls, muffled and soft, as though nature sought to hush all distraction for what was to come. Professor Ashworth arrived precisely at 9 o'clock, stamping snow from his boots in our vestibule and ascending with purposeful tread. His face showed determination overlaying fear, the look of one who has resolved to face something difficult, regardless of personal apprehension. "Gentlemen," he greeted us, removing his snow-dusted coat, "I am ready, or as ready as one can be, for something utterly unprecedented in my experience. I confess I spent much of today composing letters to family and colleagues, to be delivered only if I should, not return. It seemed prudent to prepare for all contingencies." "A wise precaution," Holmes agreed. "Though I believe our primary risk is disappointment rather than danger, the possibility that nothing whatsoever will occur, and we will have spent the longest night in watchful waiting for phenomena that exist only in legend and misunderstanding." We settled into our positions, arranged in a triangle, with each of us occupying a point, creating a human perimeter around the cleared central space. Holmes had positioned our chairs such that we faced inward while still maintaining comfortable distance. The fire burned steadily in its grate, providing warmth and light, supplemented by several lamps turned low to create atmosphere without harsh illumination. On a small table within easy reach, Holmes had placed various items for documentation: notebooks and pencils, a thermometer to track temperature changes, compasses to note any magnetic irregularities, and a pocket watch accurate to the second, so we could precisely mark the solstice moment. "The calculated time is 11:43 and 27 seconds, Holmes reminded us. As we approach that moment, I suggest we maintain silence and focus our attention upon the central space, observing carefully for any changes in atmosphere, temperature, light quality, or perception. If you experience any unusual sensations, please describe them aloud so we all may note them. We seek objective observation rather than individual hallucination." The minutes passed with agonizing slowness, marked by the clock's steady ticking and the soft crackle of the fire. Outside, snow continued its silent accumulation, building London into something otherworldly, a city of dreams where boundaries might indeed grow thin. As the clock approached 11:30, I became aware of a peculiar quality entering the atmosphere, a sense of expectancy or attention, as though the very air had become alert. My rational mind dismissed this as projected imagination, but the sensation persisted and seemed to intensify as we drew nearer to the calculated moment. "I feel something," Professor Ashworth murmured. "A change in air pressure, perhaps, or a vibration at the edge of hearing. I cannot precisely define it, but the atmosphere has altered." "I perceive it as well," Holmes confirmed quietly, his eyes fixed upon the empty space between us. "Watson." "Yes," I admitted, though I cannot determine whether I am experiencing actual phenomena or expectation-induced imagination. "Maintain observation," Holmes instructed. 11:41, 2 minutes and 27 seconds remaining. The peculiar sensation grew more pronounced, evolving from barely perceptible to unmistakable. The air seemed to thicken, to gain texture, as though we sat not in normal atmosphere, but in something approaching liquid, transparent but substantial. The firelight began to behave strangely, its glow seeming to bend and refract through the altered air in ways that defied normal physics. "The thermometer is dropping," Holmes noted, his voice carrying scientific detachment that steadied my growing unease. 3 degrees in the past minute, despite the fire burning unchanged. The compasses on the table began to spin slowly, their needles rotating in steady circles, rather than pointing north. This was objective, observable phenomena, not imagination, but measurable alteration in our environment. 1 minute, Holmes said quietly. "Remain calm. Remember, we are observers. We need not participate beyond observation." The final minute stretched into subjective eternity. The sensation of thickness in the air increased, until I felt I could almost see it, almost perceive the space between us as layered, dimensional in ways beyond the normal 3. The fire's light painted everything in uncertain illumination, creating shadows that seemed too dark, too solid, and spaces that seemed too luminous to be explained by available light sources. The clock began its chiming announcement of the 3/4 hour, and as the final chime faded, everything changed. The change manifested not as dramatic transformation, but as subtle shift, like eyes adjusting to darkness, and suddenly perceiving what had been present but invisible all along. The empty space at the center of our triangle was no longer empty, or rather, it contained something that existed in that uncertain category between presence and absence, between visible and invisible. At first, I perceived it as merely a distortion, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. But as I continued watching, unable to look away, held by fascination that overwhelmed fear, the distortion gained definition. It suggested form without possessing solidity, suggested dimension without occupying definite space. It reminded me simultaneously of aurora borealis, of watercolor paintings before the paint dries, of reflection on disturbed water, and of none of these things at all. "Are you seeing this?" Professor Ashworth whispered, his voice carrying awe more than terror. "Yes," Holmes replied, his tone remaining remarkably controlled, though I detected underlying excitement. "I am seeing it. Watson?" "I see it," I confirmed. "Or I see something. I cannot precisely define what I perceive, but I am definitely perceiving something beyond normal atmosphere occupying that space." The form, if it could be called a form, seemed to be observing us as much as we observed it. I experienced a sensation I can only describe as being looked at, being regarded with attention that was simultaneously alien and not hostile, curious rather than threatening. The presence felt vast, as though what we perceived represented only the smallest fraction of something whose true scope exceeded our capacity to encompass. "It's beautiful," Professor Ashworth murmured. "I did not expect beauty. I imagined fear or horror, but this is beautiful." He was right, though the beauty was strange, uncategorizable. Colours shifted through the presence that I could not name, having never seen their like before. Patterns suggested themselves, geometries that my mind could not quite grasp, mathematical relationships that exceeded three-dimensional representation. Holmes rose slowly from his chair, moving with cautious deliberation, approaching the presence with the careful steps of one approaching a wild creature that might startle and flee. "I am going to attempt communication," he said softly. "Please document whatever you observe." He stood at what I judged to be approximately 3 feet from the presence's nearest perceptible edge, though even that was uncertain, as its boundaries seemed fluid rather than fixed. He spoke in clear, measured tones. "We are seekers of understanding. We mean no harm or disrespect. We wish only to observe and perhaps to comprehend." The presence responded, not with sound, or not with sound alone, but with a sensation that bypassed auditory processing and registered directly in consciousness. I received an impression of vast patience, of attention focused across unimaginable duration, of curiosity reciprocating our own, and underlying all this, a sense of doorway, of threshold, of invitation extended if we chose to accept it. Images began to form within or around the presence, fleeting visions that came and vanished too quickly for detailed observation. I glimpsed landscapes of ice beneath skies filled with impossible lights. I saw figures that might have been human, but walked with strange grace across boundaries between states. I perceived what might have been Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis, not vanished, but translated somehow, existing in the spaces between, serving as bridges or explorers in territories beyond normal human experience. "They went willingly," Professor Ashworth said, tears flowing freely down his face, though he smiled. "They crossed over, chose to become part of this, to explore what lies beyond our ordinary perception. Oh, Thomas, Margaret, what extraordinary courage." Holmes remained standing before the presence, and I saw his hand reach out slowly, incrementally, drawn toward contact, perhaps despite his conscious intention. I rose from my chair, some instinct warning me that contact might mean transformation, might mean crossing a boundary from which return was impossible. "Holmes," I called softly, urgently, "remember, we are observers only. Do not cross. Not tonight. Not without greater understanding." He paused, his hand hovering inches from the presence's uncertain edge. For a long moment he remained frozen, caught between the gravitational pull of mystery and the anchor of our friendship, our partnership, our shared life in these familiar rooms. Then he withdrew his hand, stepping back, returning to the triangle of our observation. "You are correct, Watson. Tonight we observe. Perhaps someday, with greater preparation and understanding, we might choose to venture further, but not tonight." As though responding to his decision, the presence began to fade, not vanishing abruptly, but dissolving gradually, like fog burning off under morning sun. The compressed thickness of the air eased. The compass's needles steadied, resuming their normal directional function. The fire returned to ordinary behavior, its light no longer bending through altered space. Within 5 minutes, our sitting room appeared entirely normal once more. Just 3 men sitting in chairs around an empty space. The carved figures and drawn symbols merely curious decorations, rather than functional apparatus. Only the profound sense of having witnessed something extraordinary remained, and the memory of beauty that transcended categorization. We sat in silence for a long time, none of us speaking, each processing what we had experienced. The clock resumed its patient counting of moments that suddenly seemed more precious, more charged with potential than they had been before we understood how thin the boundaries really were. Finally, as midnight approached and passed, moving us beyond the solstice moment into the gradual return of light's dominion, Holmes stirred and reached for his notebook, beginning to write with his usual precision and thoroughness. "We must document everything while memory remains fresh," he said. "This is perhaps the most extraordinary investigation I have ever conducted, and regardless of whether anyone else ever believes our account, we must record it faithfully." We spent the next hour doing exactly that, each of us writing independently, comparing notes, sketching what we had seen to the extent that such ephemeral phenomena could be captured on paper. Professor Ashworth wrote with particular emotion, his scientific training at war with personal feeling, producing an account that was simultaneously rigorous and deeply moved. "What do we tell the authorities?" I asked eventually. "Inspector Gregson expects some report regarding the disappearances. We can hardly submit a statement claiming that Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis crossed into another state of existence through a threshold that opened during the winter solstice. We tell him," Holmes said carefully, "that we believe the missing persons left their homes voluntarily, driven by beliefs they had developed following their Arctic expedition. We tell him that these beliefs related to indigenous knowledge systems regarding altered states of consciousness and perception. We tell him that in our judgment, both individuals are beyond reach of conventional search, having ventured into territories, whether geographical, psychological, or metaphysical, where they wished to be, and where they cannot be followed by those unwilling to make similar journeys. It is truth, Watson, simply truth expressed in language that avoids commitments to specific ontological frameworks. Will he accept such a report?" Professor Ashworth asked doubtfully. "Gregson is accustomed to my sometimes unconventional conclusions. He will mark the case as closed due to voluntary disappearance, which satisfies legal requirements, even if it leaves emotional questions unresolved. The families deserve to know that their loved ones were not victims of violence or accident, but rather explorers who found what they were seeking, even if that finding took them beyond the boundaries of return." We talked deep into the after-midnight hours, processing not just what we had witnessed, but what it implied for our understanding of reality itself. The conversation ranged across philosophy, physics, consciousness studies, anthropology, and metaphysics, circling always around the central question: what had we actually experienced? Was it objectively real, I asked at one point? Or did we create a shared hallucination through expectation and ceremony, convincing ourselves we perceived something that existed only in our collective imagination? Holmes considered this carefully. The compasses behaved anomalously, which represents objective, measurable phenomena independent of perception. The temperature dropped measurably. These facts suggest something occurred that exceeded mere hallucination, but whether that something represented entities from another dimension, aspects of consciousness we do not yet understand, or some third possibility I cannot even properly formulate, that remains unclear. What I can say with certainty is that reality appears to contain more possibilities than our conventional frameworks acknowledge, and that human consciousness, under specific conditions, may interface with those possibilities in ways we are only beginning to glimpse. The Inuit have known this for centuries, Professor Ashworth noted. Their shamanic traditions, which European science dismissed as primitive superstition, contain sophisticated understanding of states and entities. We are just now beginning to recognize might actually exist. We owe them tremendous apology and enormous gratitude. As the clock chimed 3 in the morning, we finally began to dismantle the arrangement we had created, returning our sitting room to its normal configuration. The carved figures were carefully wrapped and stored. The drawn symbols were collected for archiving. The furniture was returned to its customary positions. Within an hour, one would never know anything unusual had occurred in these rooms. Professor Ashworth prepared to depart as dawn began to suggest itself at the horizon's edge, the darkness fractionally less absolute. "Thank you, gentlemen," he said, shaking both our hands with genuine warmth, "for taking my concerns seriously, for investigating with rigor and courage, and for helping me understand that Thomas and Margaret found something extraordinary, rather than meeting some terrible fate. I shall write to their families, carefully, suggesting that their loved ones were explorers in the truest sense, venturing beyond known territories in search of understanding." After he departed, Holmes and I sat once more in our chairs, watching as London gradually emerged from night into the first dawn of lengthening days. The snow had stopped, leaving the city pristine and peaceful, as though the world had been purified by the solstice passage. "Do you think we shall ever speak of this publicly, Holmes?" I asked. "Will you allow me to publish an account among my chronicles of your cases?" He smiled slightly. "Publish it, Watson, but perhaps not yet. Let some years pass. Let the immediate strangeness settle into memory and reflection. Then tell the story as you have told others, faithfully, but with awareness that readers will interpret it according to their own frameworks of belief. Some will dismiss it as fiction thinly veiled as fact. Some will embrace it as confirmation of what they already believed about reality's hidden dimensions. Some will read it as metaphor for psychological or philosophical truths, rather than literal events. All these interpretations have validity, as truth often contains multiple layers that different observers access according to their readiness. And you, Holmes, what will you carry forward from this investigation?" He gazed into the dying fire, its embers glowing like distant stars, like the lights we had seen within the presence. "I will carry forward humility, Watson. Humility before the vastness of what we do not yet understand, and wonder at the possibility that consciousness, human consciousness, our consciousness, may be far stranger and far more capable than conventional materialism suggests. We stand at thresholds every day, boundaries between known and unknown, between current understanding and potential revelation. Most days, we do not cross those thresholds, and that is entirely appropriate. Life requires stability, familiarity, the solid ground of consensus reality. But knowing the thresholds exist, knowing that they can occasionally be perceived and even crossed by those prepared to make the attempt, that knowledge changes everything while changing nothing at all. We sat in companionable silence as full morning arrived, as the city awakened to its daily routines, as Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the stairs announced the beginning of ordinary domestic life. The mystery was not solved in the conventional sense. We could not produce Captain Whitmore or Dr. Hollis, could not explain in scientifically acceptable terms where they had gone, or how they had vanished from locked rooms. But we understood, in ways that exceeded intellectual comprehension, that mystery had been met and honoured, that the unknown had been approached with respect and courage, and that some questions answer themselves through the asking, rather than through definitive resolution. The days following our solstice observation fell into rhythms of reflection and routine. Holmes resumed his usual activities, analysing chemical compounds, visiting Scotland Yard for consultations, receiving clients with their various predicaments. I returned to my medical practice and my writing, though I found both activities subtly transformed by what we had experienced, as though I now perceived an additional dimension within ordinary life, a depth or resonance that had always been present, but which I now recognized consciously. We heard through Professor Ashworth that Mrs. Whitmore and Dr. Hollis's family had received our report with mixed reactions. Grief at confirmed absence, but also strange comfort at the suggestion that their loved ones had ventured somewhere rather than meeting violent ends. The official police conclusion was voluntary disappearance, which satisfied legal requirements, if not emotional needs. The carved figures and Arctic artifacts were returned to the Royal Society, where they joined other materials, cataloguing human interaction with mysteries that resisted definitive classification. Professor Ashworth published a paper on Inuit shamanic traditions that was well received in anthropological circles, though he carefully framed his discussion in terms of cultural knowledge systems, rather than making claims about the objective reality of the phenomena those traditions described. As for Holmes and myself, we occasionally discussed our experience, though less frequently as time passed and the immediate vividness faded into memory. We never attempted to recreate the conditions of that solstice night, having satisfied ourselves that the threshold existed and could be approached without requiring that we cross it. Perhaps the most lasting impact was the gentlest one, an increased capacity for wonder, for entertaining possibilities beyond the immediate and obvious, for recognizing that consciousness itself remains one of the great unexplored territories of human experience. We continued our work as detective and chronicler, investigating the mysteries that arose in the course of ordinary life. But we carried within us knowledge that the truly extraordinary exists adjacent to the ordinary, separated by boundaries thinner and more permeable than conventional wisdom acknowledges. Years later, when I finally published this account, I followed Holmes's suggestion to present it as simply one more case among many, letting readers draw their own conclusions about its nature and implications. Some dismissed it as my most fanciful fiction, others embraced it as literal truth, and some recognized it as occupying that uncertain territory where experience exceeds explanation, which is precisely where it belongs. The Arctic keeps its secrets still. Somewhere in those frozen wastes, or perhaps in dimensions adjacent to them, explorers of consciousness continue their investigations. Having chosen to cross thresholds, most of us only glimpse. Whether we name them missing or transformed, lost or evolved, depends entirely on the frameworks we bring to the question. But on winter solstices, when darkness achieves its maximum reach, and light begins its slow return, when snow falls soft and thick over London streets and the boundaries between states grow permeable, I sometimes stand at our window in Baker Street and wonder what Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis now understand that we do not. Wonder what territories they explore and what knowledge they accumulate. Wonder whether consciousness truly ends at the boundaries of our skulls and sensory apparatus, or whether it extends far beyond those limits into spaces we have yet to properly map or even imagine. And in that wondering, in that openness to possibilities that exceed current understanding, I find a kind of peace. Not the peace of answers definitively obtained, but the peace of questions honoured, of mystery respected, of the unknown acknowledged as a legitimate realm of being, rather than merely a temporary gap in knowledge waiting to be filled. This is perhaps the deepest lesson of the Arctic Chimera, that some mysteries invite us not to solve them, but to stand in their presence with awareness and humility, recognizing that reality contains spaces where the extraordinary becomes natural, and the impossible reveals itself as simply unrecognized possibility. The fire burns low in our grate now, dear listener, and the tale draws toward its natural close. Outside these comfortable rooms, London sleeps under winter skies, each person dreaming their own dreams, crossing their own internal thresholds between waking and sleep, consciousness and unconsciousness, the known self and all that lies beyond its familiar boundaries. You too stand at a threshold now, the boundary between waking awareness and the vast territories of sleep, where consciousness transforms into forms and patterns your waking mind does not remember, but your sleeping mind navigates with perfect ease. Perhaps the threshold beings exist within those sleeping realms as much as in Arctic wastes. Perhaps they are aspects of our own consciousness, patient and vast, waiting always at the margins of awareness for those moments when we relax our grip on ordinary perception and allow ourselves to perceive more broadly, more deeply, more strangely. As you drift now into sleep, carried on the rhythms of this story, like a boat on gentle currents, know that you are safe, that the thresholds you cross in dreams are natural and necessary, that consciousness expands and contracts with each breath, each heartbeat, each transition between states. The mysteries we have explored tonight in Victorian Gaslight translate directly into the mysteries you navigate every night in the private theatre of your sleeping mind. Let the snow continue falling in your imagination, soft and infinite, covering everything in peaceful white, simplifying the complex world into gentle contours and quiet spaces. Let the fire burn steady in its grate, providing warmth without demanding attention, a constant companion in the background of awareness. Let the ticking clock mark moments that stretch and slow, seconds becoming spacious enough to hold entire dreams, entire lifetimes of sleeping adventure. Holmes sits in his chair, pipe smoke drifting upward in lazy spirals, satisfied that another mystery has been honoured if not solved, another threshold approached with courage and curiosity. Watson rests in his room nearby, his breathing steady and deep, his dreams filled with ice and light, and the patient presence of vast awareness that watches always from the margins of the known. And you, dear listener, faithful companion through this long story, you rest now in your own comfortable space, your own safe haven, your body releasing the day's tensions, your mind releasing the day's concerns, allowing all of it to drift away like snow melting into water, like water evaporating into air, like air expanding into spaces that have no name or boundary. The threshold beings, if they exist, watch with benevolent patience, curious about human consciousness and its infinite variations, each individual a unique expression of the mystery of awareness itself. They do not threaten or demand. They simply observe, waiting for those rare moments when a human consciousness reaches out beyond its usual limits and briefly touches something vast and strange and ultimately impossible to fully comprehend or communicate. But that's all right. Comprehension is not required. Communication is not necessary. Simply the reaching out, the attempt to connect, the willingness to wonder. These alone have value beyond measure. So sleep now, gentle friend. Sleep deep and dream well. Let the mysteries of consciousness carry you through the night on currents that have flowed since the first awareness awakened in the universe and wondered at itself. You are safe. You are held. You are part of something infinitely larger than your waking mind can grasp, but which your sleeping mind navigates with perfect trust and ancient wisdom. The Arctic Chimera, that creature of threshold and legend, was never a monster to be feared, but a symbol of all that exists beyond our ordinary perception, all that waits patiently for our attention, all that invites us to expand our understanding of what is possible, what is real, what consciousness itself might be capable of becoming. Tomorrow you will wake to ordinary light and ordinary concerns, and that is good and right and necessary. But tonight, in the vast territories of sleep, you are an explorer like Captain Whitmore and Dr. Hollis, venturing beyond known boundaries, discovering landscapes of consciousness that cannot be mapped but only experienced, only honored, only remembered in fragments that feel more true than any waking fact. Rest now, dream now, cross now into sleep's threshold, knowing that morning will return you safely to the familiar world, but that these night journeys connect you to mysteries as vast as Arctic skies, as patient as ice, as beautiful as aurora dancing across dimensions our waking minds can barely glimpse. Good night, dear friend. Thank you for traveling with us through this tale of snow and mystery, of science and wonder, of boundaries discovered and honored, but not necessarily crossed. If you enjoyed this journey into the atmospheric realms, where Victorian detection meets metaphysical mystery, please do consider subscribing to this channel, leaving a like to help others find these sleep stories, and sharing your thoughts in the comments about which mysteries you would most like to explore next. May your dreams be vast and strange, and filled with the gentle presence of awareness discovering itself. May your sleep be deep and restorative, carrying you through the long night on currents of story and imagination, returning you to morning renewed and peaceful. Until we meet again in some future tale, I bid you the most restful of nights, and remind you that consciousness is always far stranger and more wonderful than you might imagine, and that is not a cause for fear, but for the deepest, most abiding wonder. Sweet dreams, dear listener, sweet, sweet dreams. The fire settles to embers, the snow continues falling, the clock ticks on, and in the vast silence of the longest night, thresholds wait patient and luminous, neither demanding nor denying, simply present, simply there, simply inviting those who would venture beyond the familiar, into territories where mystery and consciousness meet and dance and become, for a moment, indistinguishable from one another. Sleep now. The story is complete. The night surrounds you with gentle darkness, and all, in its own perfect way, is exactly as it should be. Good night.